18 years of loyalty meant nothing the moment Amanda Thompson walked in wearing a faded coat. "Your kind gets scammed easily," the manager barks, loud enough for the entire bank to hear. Amanda freezes as security closes in. But a young trainee is looking at a computer screen that proves the manager is lying, and what he does next shocks everyone. You won't believe how this ends. Subscribe now so you never miss a story of justice, and comment below with your city. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Now, back to the showdown. Amanda Thompson sat at her small kitchen table, the early morning light catching the stack of white envelopes piled near her cold cup of tea. She didn't need to open them to know what they said. Most were printed in bold red ink with words like overdue and final notice screaming from the transparent windows. Since her sister Sarah had passed away 6 weeks ago, the house had grown quiet, but the noise of the debt was becoming deafening. Sarah had fought a long, grueling battle with an illness that eventually took her life, but even in her final days, she had been thinking about Amanda. She had left behind a modest inheritance, not a fortune, but enough to clear the medical arrears and pay off the back taxes on the family home they had shared for decades. To Amanda, that money wasn't just a balance in a bank account, it was Sarah's final gift, a way of ensuring that Amanda wouldn't be left out on the street while she was still grieving. Amanda reached into her worn leather purse and pulled out the folded withdrawal slip she had prepared the night before. Her hand shook slightly as she smoothed it out on the table. $75,000. It was more money than she had ever held at once, yet it felt like a heavy weight. She checked her reflection in the hallway mirror, patting her hair into place and straightening her coat. She wanted to look presentable, though she felt anything but steady. She had been a customer at the First National branch on the corner for 18 years. The staff there had seen her through the opening of her first savings account, the death of her husband, and every small milestone in between. She knew the layout of the lobby by heart, the way the heavy doors felt under her hand, and the familiar faces behind the glass. As she stepped out onto the sidewalk, the brisk air hit her face, a sharp reminder of the world moving on around her. She walked with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in weeks. This was the final hurdle. Once she had the check in her hand, she could go to the hospital's billing department, then to the county office, and finally, she could breathe. She reached the bank just as the security guard was unlocking the doors. He gave her a polite nod, a gesture of recognition for a woman who had walked through these doors 1,000 times over nearly 2 decades. Amanda took a deep breath, clutching her purse tightly against her side. She walked toward the teller line, her heart thumping against her ribs, telling herself over and over that this was her money, this was her sister's legacy, and today, the worrying would finally stop. She just needed to get to the counter. Amanda reached the teller window and slid her withdrawal slip toward the young man behind the glass, but before he could even touch it, a shadow fell over the counter. A man in a sharp, restrictive grey suit stepped in, his eye scanning Amanda from her scuffed shoes to the faded collar of her coat before even looking at her face. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply plucked the slip from the counter with 2 fingers, as if it were something he didn't want to get his hands dirty with. "I'm Mr. Hall, the manager," he said, his voice flat and loud enough to make the customers in the next line turn their heads. He looked down at the paper, then back at Amanda, his brow furrowing into a permanent expression of doubt. "You're looking to withdraw $75,000. In cash and cashier's checks." "Yes, sir," Amanda said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I have the account details right there. I've been with this branch since it opened." Mr. Hall didn't acknowledge her history. He tapped the signature line on the slip. "This signature doesn't look right to me. It's shaky. Unsteady. My hands are a little cold, and I'm a bit nervous, Mr. Hall." "It's a lot of money," she explained, reaching for her purse. "I have my ID right here. And my sister's death certificate and the probate papers. Everything is legal." He didn't even reach for the document she held out. Instead, he leaned back, crossing his arms. He let his gaze linger on the worn edges of her leather purse, a look of pure condescension crossing his face. "I see a lot of people coming in here with stories about inheritances and long-lost relatives. Usually, people with accounts of this size don't walk in off the street looking like they just finished a shift in a garden. The sting of his words hit her harder than a physical blow. Amanda felt the heat rising in her neck. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 50 years, Mr. Hall. I was a teacher here. I'm not a gardener, and I'm certainly not a liar." "I didn't call you a liar," he snapped, though his tone suggested exactly that. "I'm saying I have a responsibility to protect this institution from fraudulent activity. This amount of money requires a level of verification that I'm not sure you can provide today. We see your types of cases often, older women being coached by scammers to drain accounts." "I am not being coached," Amanda whispered, her voice trembling now with a mix of shame and growing anger. "That is my money. My sister worked 30 years at the post office for that money." Mr. Hall sighed, a long, exaggerated sound of boredom. He tossed the slip back onto the counter. It fluttered and nearly fell to the floor. "I'm not approving this. The signature is inconsistent, your appearance doesn't match the account profile, and quite frankly, I don't feel comfortable handing over a small fortune to someone who might be a security risk." He turned his back to her, dismissing her as if she were nothing more than a glitch in his morning schedule. "I said no, and that's the end of it," Mr. Hall shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings and cutting through the quiet hum of the morning. He didn't care who heard him. In fact, he seemed to want the audience. He leaned over the counter, invading Amanda's space until she had to take a step back. "We see people like you all the time. You come in here with these stories, but the reality is that your kind get scammed easily. You're probably being used as a mule for some offshore scheme and you don't even have the sense to realize it." Amanda felt the blood drain from her face. The word kind hung in the air like a physical weight. The couple at the next window stopped their conversation. The elderly man by the door lowered his newspaper. The entire lobby had gone silent, and every eye was now fixed on the small woman in the faded coat who was being spoken to like a criminal. "Please," Amanda whispered, her voice cracking. "You're making a scene. I just want to access my account." "You're the one making a scene by demanding funds I've already deemed suspicious," Hall retorted, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He signaled to the guard standing near the entrance. "Gary! We have a situation over here. This woman is refusing to leave the window after a denied transaction. She's obstructing our business." The heavy boots of the security guard thudded against the floor. Amanda stood frozen, her hand still clutching the strap of her purse so hard her knuckles were white. She looked around the room, hoping for a friendly face, a witness, or someone to say that this wasn't right. But most people looked away, uncomfortable with the raw display of power. She felt a wave of heat wash over her, a mix of intense shame and the sheer, crushing unfairness of being treated like a thief in the very place she had trusted with her life's earnings for 18 years. "You need to step away from the counter," the guard said, reaching for her arm. "I haven't done anything wrong," Amanda said, her voice trembling but gaining a tiny spark of defiance. "I am a customer. I am a person." "You're a liability," Hall sneered, crossing his arms and looking down at her. "And if you don't move right now, I'll have you removed for trespassing. We don't have time for these games. Move along before this gets even uglier for you." Amanda didn't move. She couldn't. Her legs felt like they were made of lead. She was trapped between the manager's arrogance and the guard's hand, stripped of her dignity in front of a dozen strangers, all because a man in a suit decided she didn't look like she belonged in her own life. Rodgers Townsend watched the scene unfold from the next station, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. He was only 23, and this was the second week of his dream internship, a path he hoped would lead to a stable career to help his mother. But as he looked at the woman being bullied by his manager, he felt a sick knot tightening in his stomach. He knew Amanda Thompson. Not personally, but he had seen her name on the daily transaction logs. While Mr. Hall continued to berate her, Rodgers quietly pulled up her account profile on his own monitor. He clicked through the screens with a sense of urgency. The records were pristine. There were 18 years of consistent deposits, a steady balance, and a clear paper trail for the inheritance deposit from 3 weeks prior. Everything was documented, verified, and flagged as low risk by the bank's own automated system. There was no fraud. There was only a woman trying to use her own money. He looked up and saw the security guard's hand closing around Amanda's elbow. She looked smaller than she had a moment ago, her eyes glassy with a mix of shock and terror. Rodgers thought of his mother, a woman who had worked double shifts cleaning offices to keep him in school, and how she would feel if a man in a suit treated her like a criminal in public. He remembered her voice telling him that a job is just a job, but your character is your life. If he spoke up, Hall would fire him before he could finish his sentence. He was a trainee, he had no standing, no authority, and no protection. But if he stayed silent, he was helping Hall do this to her. "Sir, excuse me," Rodgers said. His voice was thin at first, barely audible over the manager's shouting. Hall didn't even look at him. "Not now, Rodgers. Stay out of this." Rodgers took a deep breath and stood up, pushing his chair back so hard it hit the wall. "Mr. Hall, I've pulled up the account records on my terminal." Hall turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Sit down, trainee. You're overstepping." "With all due respect, sir, the policy says we only deny a withdrawal if there is a discrepancy in the KYC or a flag on the funds," Rodgers said, his voice gaining a steady, firm edge. He pointed at his screen. "I'm looking at Mrs. Thompson's profile right now. The inheritance was cleared by compliance 10 days ago. The ID she's holding matches the digital scan on file perfectly. There is no reason to refuse her. She is a legacy customer." The lobby went even quieter, if that was possible. The security guard hesitated, his grip on Amanda's arm loosening. "You're done here, Townsend," Hall hissed, stepping toward the young man. "Pack your things. You're fired for insubordination and violating privacy protocols by accessing an account you weren't assigned to." "I'm doing my job, which is to serve the customers," Rodgers replied, his heart racing but his legs refusing to buckle. He looked past Hall to Amanda and gave her a small, quick nod. "It's your money, Mrs. Thompson. Everything is in order." Mr. Hall didn't even look at the screen Rodgers was pointing to. He took a step toward the trainee, his face twisted in a snarl that stripped away any remaining professional facade. "I don't care what the screen says," Hall hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low tremor. "I told you to sit down. You're young, you're naive, and you've just thrown your career away for a woman who doesn't even have the sense to dress for a bank. You're fired. Get your coat and get out of my lobby before I have Gary escort you out too." The security guard looked from the manager to the trainee, his hand hovering uncertainly near Amanda's shoulder. He didn't move. No one did. The silence in the lobby was so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "Actually, he's not going anywhere." The voice came from a woman who had been sitting quietly in the waiting area for the last 20 minutes. She had looked like any other customer, dressed in a plain navy blazer and holding a simple tablet in her lap. She stood up now, walking toward the counter with a steady, unhurried pace that demanded attention. Hall spun around, his frustration boiling over. "This is a private matter. Please return to your seat or leave the building." The woman didn't stop until she was standing directly in front of him. She didn't look angry, she looked clinical. She turned her tablet around so Hall could see the screen. It wasn't a banking app or a news site. It was a live recording interface, and the audio waveform was still dancing as it captured the sound of Hall's heavy breathing. "My name is Lucy Jenkins," she said, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the room. "I'm the regional compliance supervisor for this district. I was sent here unannounced to conduct a mystery shops and a behavioral audit following 3 separate complaints of discriminatory service at this branch." Hall's face went from a heated red to a sickly, chalky grey in seconds. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "I've been sitting there since the doors opened," Jenkins continued, her eyes locked on Hall's. "I heard you question this woman's identity without looking at her documents. I heard you use the phrase your kind. I heard you threaten a customer of 18 years with security because you didn't like her appearance. And I just heard you attempt to terminate an employee for the crime of following federal banking policy and treating a human being with basic dignity." She turned to Rodgers, who was still standing by his desk, looking like he had just seen a ghost. "Mr. Townsend, stay where you are. Your employment is not in jeopardy. In fact, you are the only person behind this counter currently acting in accordance with this bank's charter." Then she turned to Amanda, her expression softening for the first time. "Mrs. Thompson, I am deeply sorry for what you've experienced here this morning. It is inexcusable." Hall finally found his voice, though it was weak and cracking. "Lucy, you don't understand the context. We've had so many fraud alerts lately, I was just being. You were being a liability." Jenkins cut him off, using the very word he had thrown at Amanda. "You didn't check the files. You didn't check the ID. You checked her skin and her clothes, and you made a judgment that is going to cost this bank a lot more than $75,000. Give me your keys and your internal access badge. Now." Hall fumbled with his lanyard, his fingers shaking so violently that he nearly tore the fabric before finally unhooking his ID badge. He dropped it onto the counter with a hollow plastic clatter. Lucy Jenkins picked it up without a word and gestured toward the door. Gary, the security guard who had been told to remove Amanda moments ago, now placed a firm hand on Hall's shoulder, guiding the former manager toward the exit in front of the entire lobby. The silence was absolute until the heavy glass doors clicked shut behind them. The tension in the room broke like a fever. Lucy turned to Rodgers, who was still standing tall, though the adrenaline was clearly starting to fade from his face. "Mr. Townsend," she said, her voice echoing with a new kind of authority, one rooted in respect. "Go back to your station. I want you to be the one to finish this. Take as much time as Mrs. Thompson needs, and ensure every decimal point is exactly where she wants it." Rodgers nodded and sat back down, his eyes meeting Amanda's. The fear that had clouded the transaction was gone, replaced by a quiet, shared understanding. Amanda stepped back up to the window, her hand still trembling, but this time it wasn't from shame. It was relief. "I have the cashier's checks ready for the medical center and the county office," Rodgers said softly, his fingers moving across the keys with purpose. "And the rest is being placed in a secure envelope for you, Mrs. Thompson. I've also waived every transaction fee associated with this account for the next year. It's the least we can do." Amanda watched him work. She saw the way he double-checked the figures, not out of suspicion, but out of a desire to protect her. "You didn't have to do that, young man," she whispered. "You could have lost your job." Rodgers looked up and smiled. It was a tired but honest smile. "My mother always told me that a job you have to lose your soul to keep isn't a job worth having. I'm just glad you're getting what's yours." He slid the documents and the funds across the counter. For the first time in 18 years, Amanda didn't feel like just a number or a profile in a database, she felt seen. She tucked the checks into her purse, the checks that meant her home was safe, that her sister's debts were gone, and that she could finally grieve without the shadow of a collector over her shoulder. As she turned to leave, the customers who had been watching began to disperse, but several stopped to offer her a nod or a kind word. Lucy Jenkins walked her to the door, placing a hand on the handle. "There will be a formal apology coming from our headquarters, Mrs. Thompson. And I'll be personally overseeing the transition of this branch." Amanda stepped out into the midday sun. The air felt different, lighter, cleaner. She looked back through the glass and saw Rodgers helping the next person in line with the same focused, respectful attention he had given her. She realized then that while the world was full of men like Mr. Hall, it was also being inherited by people like Rodgers. She walked down the street toward the county office, her grip firm on her purse, knowing that her sister's legacy was secure and that, for once, the right person had won. Amanda reached her small porch and sat on the swing, the heavy weight that had lived in her chest for weeks finally lifting. She looked at the neighborhood she had called home for 50 years, knowing now that no one could take it from her. She thought of Rodgers, a young man who had chosen his soul over a paycheck, and felt a rare surge of hope. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been restored by the next generation. Sarah's legacy was safe, and for the first time since the funeral, Amanda smiled, a deep, genuine smile of a woman who was no longer invisible. If you believe that doing the right thing is always worth the risk, give this video a thumbs up. Stories like Amanda's remind us that one voice of courage can change everything. Don't miss our next powerful story of justice and transformation. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to join our community. See you in the next one.